Well, joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have journalist, author, and activist, Mr. Fra Hughes, joining us from Belfast. Also, from Islamabad, we have journalist and political commentator Syed Mohsin Abbas. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Hughes in Belfast. How do you view the role of the United States in the Yemen war? Three administrations, Democrats, Republicans, both keeping up their military support for Saudi Arabia despite the massive humanitarian death toll of this war.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me onto the show. I'd like to say that what's happening in Yemen could never have happened without the green light from both America and I would imagine the United Kingdom because of the military political ties they have with Saudi Arabia. So every plane, every attack helicopter, every missile, every bomb is supplied from either the United Kingdom or the United States, and possibly more recently from Israel. A lot of the bombings and the targeting and the sophisticated technology used to bomb the schools, the bridges, the hospitals, the infrastructure, the civilian huddling in their homes for safety is led by British, American and Israeli technical military advisors. So each one of those countries that I have mentioned are totally morally responsible for every death in Yemen. There is no need for one death. American foreign policy was changed and they decided that they didn't want to kill civilians in the name of American people. Then everyone in the region, including Israel, would be forced to find some form of political agreement with their neighbours to live in peace. And just to add to that, General Tommy Franks infamously was quoted as saying, "Don't do body counts." So the American military, civil and political administration cares nothing for the deaths of civilians who die in conflicts that are attached to American foreign policy. When they do dehumanize people and call the Vietnamese gooks, and they call Iraqis, Arabs and Persians in general ragheads, they care nothing for civilian human life and everything for the profits of the military, industrial, political complex.
Syed Mohsin Abbas, I want to get your thoughts on this internal U.S. government report with regards to the war on Yemen. Of course, one of the most controversial U.S. munitions sold are the Raytheon bombs. When we look at this report, one has to deduce that obviously American officials, they won't be expected to sell these munitions, sell these deadliest weapons, and then admit that the bombs are killing civilians on the ground. That would put them at risk of prosecution for war crimes, wouldn't it?
Yes, in fact, there's a memo that's floated around in 2016 internally within the US government, which says exactly this. War crimes were being linked to Raytheon's weapons simply once it was highlighted that 100 people were killed at a funeral in an airstrike in which American aircraft and weapons were used. And following that, Obama, in fact, put a stop. He put a stop on, well, at least publicly, he put a stop on Raytheon's sale of 16,000 guided missiles. A stop which actually was lifted then by Donald Trump. That was reinstated by Donald Trump. So those Raytheon missiles did eventually get there anyway. And that really epitomizes the American hypocrisy about the war in Yemen. They're supposed to have stopped all weapons. According to Biden, they were supposed to have stopped all offensive weapons. But of course, to identify what an offensive weapon is, when it's used offensively or defensively, is a very, very gray area. And quite frankly, the Americans have done nothing of the kind because they're not monitoring the ordinary civilians, as you pointed out in the report, monitoring the killings and the deaths there. In fact, they're not just not monitoring them, they're actually trying to redact and classify information which their own internal accounting departments are about to publish, but they've actually been pulled up by the State Department and are actually being essentially gerrymandered or screened so that they won't necessarily be able to tell the full story. This is actually the reality of American policy in Yemen. It's a clandestine and yet very open supply of weapons which murder, maim, kill ordinary civilians. 1.7 million children plus, it's probably more, 2 million, I think now, who are internally displaced because of the violence, this violence. And as that violence intensifies, particularly around places like Marib, more families are fleeing homes, and the knock-on effect, of course, is that a staggering
Sure.
16 to 17 million people don't have access to things like safe water, sanitation, or hygiene, which was also part of the civilian targeting done by the Saudi Air Force. So the war crimes and the actual abysmal record of American sanctioning of this war is really absolutely mind-boggling, and it has been classified already
Indeed.
by the UN as being the worst humanitarian disaster in the world.
Well, stay with us, gentlemen, as we're going to take a look at some online reactions to this news. Carlos writes, all wars are awful, but the war in Yemen waged by a Saudi-led coalition with weapons made in the US and UK is incomparably more awful than Russia's operation in Ukraine. At least 300,000 are dead, millions starving, dozens of hospitals and schools destroyed, but only a few stand with Yemen. This next user, Don Quixote, writes, Saudi Arabia and America don't want peace in Yemen. Saudi Arabia wants to destroy the country, and the United States wants to sell weapons. That's it. And lastly, Elisa Massimino writes, if President Biden is serious about wanting to end the Yemen war in which more than 10,000 children have been killed or maimed, he must stop empowering the Saudis. Let's go back to our guests on that note. Fra Hughes, coming up is U.S. President Joe Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia. I'm sure if you recall on the campaign trail, Biden promised to pressure Saudi Arabia with its rights violations. After he was elected, he said it's time to stop the war. Apparently, the priorities have changed now as Washington wants to get the kingdom, the Saudis, to open up their oil taps in order to reduce dependence on Russian oil. That seems to currently be more important for the U.S. than how many civilians are dying in Yemen of hunger, disease, or U.S. bombs. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I absolutely do. If we look at what politicians do in opposition before they're elected and the promises that they put forward to the electorate in order to vote for them, we had Zelensky elected on a platform of bringing peace between the Donbass regions and the Ukraine. If you remember, Obama's first promise was to close Guantanamo Bay, which is still open today. And we had Biden talking about the death of the journalist Khashoggi in the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey. So what we have is American foreign policy is based on the needs not of the American people, not of American industry, but of the American corporate elite and the 1%, the political, military, industrial complex that runs the country. So with the sanctions that they have placed on Russia due to its entering into the Donbass area in order to save the Russian ethnic-speaking people there from mass ethnic cleansing and potential genocide from the fascist regime in Kiev. We all know now that there's going to be problems with fertilizer deliveries, there's going to be problems with energy, and therefore everything is going to the price of goods, the price of food, the price of oil, the price of electricity, the price of gas. It's all going to go through the roof. So with the flick of a switch, as the interests of America change, then America's focus changes in line with that. And what they're going to do now is, again, go back to Saudi Arabia and ask them to increase oil production in order to help Europe and America. They're not concerned about Africa. They're not concerned about Yemen. They're not concerned about South America. They are only concerned about the white European Anglo-Saxon community that makes up the EU, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States and Canada. So white people are important. White people matter. The cost for filling a gallon of gas in America is more important than the 17 million people facing starvation in Yemen today. And the bilateral partisan politics of the American duopoly of power will mean regardless who is elected, the deep state will continue a foreign policy that has no respect for human life, that isn't white and isn't Anglo-Saxon.
Syed Mohsin Abbas, Saudi Arabia has been using U.S.-made fighter jets, bombs, and munitions to turn Yemen into the state that it is right now. But many would argue that the Saudis are as far away from their initially stated goal right now than they were since day one. And the U.S. is obviously benefiting from the arms sales. So it would be unreal to think that the United States would contribute to ending this war. In your opinion, what are the options that the Saudi rulers have right now if they want to end this war?
Well, the options they have is to drop their alliance with the Anglo-Zionist empire, stop doing what they tell them, as they have been doing for ever since their creation, to stop financing Takfiri mercenaries in the region. That's an option. There's an option to stop the war on Yemen, straightforward, because Ayatollah Khamenei said it's in your powers. You don't simply need to fight this war that you cannot win. Why is Saudi Arabia fighting a war in the Yemen which it knows it can't win? There's no logic to continuing a war that what they said would be over in a few months, but has dragged on for years and years and has no sign of ending. And in fact, the Yemeni Ansarullah are defeating the Saudis on the ground. So what sense, rightly, Ayatollah Khamenei says, does this war make? It makes no sense from any logical military or geopolitical perspective for Saudi Arabia. They have enough money. They don't need Yemens to loot Yemen in order to become wealthy. No, what they're doing is operating a policy on behalf of Anglo-Zionist empire. They're trying to make sure the Suez Canal and the pathways for the American fleets and their kind of maritime interests to be secured in Socotra Island, for instance, Yemen. In Yemen, they're also making sure that they do exactly what the Americans want for them in terms of providing a geopolitical base to counter essentially the movement, the resistance axis movement for the liberation of Yemen, the liberation of Iraq, the liberation of all these nations which have been under the yoke of Anglo-Zionist imperialism from so many decades now that one loses count. So, the Saudis themselves are just puppets on strings. Most of these planes are probably flown by Americans or Israeli jet fighters. Saudi-led coalition itself is now exploiting Yemen, the truces, the so-called truces, just to mobilize more mercenaries. So they're bleeding themselves. The Saudis themselves in this war are bleeding their own wealth dry, and in the long run, they're doing not themselves any interest, nor any interest for the Yemeni people, of course.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. Journalist and political commentator Syed Mohsin Abbas joining us from Islamabad, journalist, author, and activist Fra Hughes speaking to us from Belfast. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review. But do stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV.